I'm fortunate enough to be Zooming with IOB author, award-winning poet, and scientist Brandon Kilbourne. Brandon is a Pushcart nominated Cave Canem Prize winning poet and biologist from Louisiana originally. Having worked more than 20 years in natural history, he's worked in museums in Denver, Chicago, Berlin. He's a double publishing threat in that his scientific studies have appeared in numerous science journals, while his poetry has been published in many literary journals. Today, he's carved out a little bit of time to spend with us to talk about his latest work from Gray Wolf Press, and his poetry book is called Natural History. Brandon, I appreciate you making time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me because science and poetry aren't often paired together. They are becoming that way a little more than they had been. Could you tell us a little bit about when you first started being involved with either poetry, if it was first, or science, and how you sort of realized they could be paired together?
Yeah, so first for me, I guess, was really science. And, the way my mom tells it is that when I was, I guess, so very young, she bought me a dinosaur coloring book. And then after that, everything was dinosaurs, which I guess that is that way for a lot of little kids. So that's kind of was my gateway into science. And then just, being more into animals, in general, like zoology. But then I guess I was also someone I liked stories, I liked mythology, I liked tales. And that kind of got me into, yeah, trying to tell stories in a way, I guess. And then when I got into graduate school, um, I guess I also kind of wanted a little bit of an outlet from just doing like the academics, doing the research. And so I would write a bit more. And those poems were really not so much about science. They're just kind of like an escape in a way. So about different topics. But then I kept writing and I moved to Germany. And didn't have so many friends here. And being first in the town of Jena, which is not very big, at least not by my standards, because I was in Chicago before that. I was a bit more isolated. And so I used that opportunity to develop my craft more and focus a bit more on writing. And I guess I got serious about writing. And then I moved to Berlin, first to do a fellowship at a place called the Institute for Advanced Study Berlin, which has scholars from all kinds of fields under one roof. And I met some English literature scholars. And so got the nerve or the courage to show them my work after a few months and said, "What do you think?" And they said, "Oh, it needs a little polish, but you should try publishing." So then I got a bit more serious about it. And then, the museum in Berlin also has a humanities department. So a few historians of science, so they had a sociologist at one point. And we started talking about the history of natural history and, started trading ideas. And then, me being interested in this history kind of backdoored the science into my poetry in a way. And so I guess in some ways, my love of animals and wildlife was always in the poetry. Um, but then trying to deal more with history and these things came later. Um, so yeah, I mean, I would say that's kind of how the two came together for me. But I guess the other way they come together is because of how I see the similarities between the two fields. So I feel like in both science and poetry, the core is the question. Like, what question are we asking? What do we want to know? What do we want to learn? I think in science, usually you want some kind of concrete outcome of your experiment or your study. I think in poetry, the outcome, aside from the poem itself, is not so concrete. But still, it's just the question leading to exploration, thought, investigation. I think both science and poetry tied to observation, to imaging. At least for what I do with morphology, is imaging is crucial. I think for poetry, imagery is very essential. The metaphors you use, the language you use, the kind of the texture you're making of the poem. I think comparison is really key to my poetry. So I think of comparative method. I think of comparing species, morphologies to get at some bigger picture or trend. I think you do the same thing in poetry a lot of the times. To really look at something, to delve into the topic, you compare it to other things. And then I think, the last thing I would say between science and poetry is that surprise. So I think the most rewarding thing in science, or maybe not the most rewarding, but the most fascinating thing is that when you do a study and you get an outcome that's not what you expect or predicted. And that's kind of, to me, it's kind of thrilling. And the things I'd say with poetry, there are ways to try to write surprise into the poem for the reader when you're using line breaks, when you're using sort of a what's called a turn in the poem, where there's a shift in thought or change in thought. But also when you're writing poems, like I think in all the poems I've written, there might be one where I kind of had an idea of where it's going from the beginning. The others kind of organically develop. And so in the end, I'm surprised at what's on the page because it's not something I thought of a priori. So I think, yeah, in all these ways, science and poetry kind of go together.
That's a really good explanation. Yeah, I like thinking about that you don't know how the end is really going to end up and kind of thinking about as well the comparison of things. That's a great explanation. I'm wondering who sort of your first like poetic influences were that you even when you set out to start writing, what made you sort of want to write poetry? Did you have a favorite poet in mind that you thought, oh, I want to do something similar, or I like it inspired, they inspired you?
That's a great question. Thanks. It's funny. I would say, like when I was learning poetry in high school, or like just in school as a kid, none really jumped at me. I would say like maybe William Blake's The Tiger, just as an individual poem, jumped at me because it's just such beautiful language and imagery. Um, and I remember I liked Walt Whitman in high school, but I didn't really dive into it independently of like what we learned in class. When I was in graduate school, because I guess before I moved to Germany and started writing poems more seriously, when I came to graduate school, I started reading poetry more seriously, just, as kind of an outlet from the science. And then I started like on my own really reading Walt Whitman. And that's where I kind of really kind of fell into I guess his work. So I guess like another thing I read while in graduate school was a book called Poet's Choice by Edward Hirsch. And it's sort of a collection of columns he wrote that feature a poem or poets. Um, and the thing is, like, a lot of like I have colleagues, and I think this myself, I have colleagues who think, oh, when I publish a paper and I cite other studies, I'm in a dialogue with those studies and those researchers, whether those studies are very old or very new or however. And what I learned reading Poet's Choice is that the book collects poets and poems from different cultures, whether it's English language cultures, Japanese, Aztec, Polish, very old poems, recent poems, poems from different perspectives, all kind of in one between two covers. And I felt like there was this dialogue happening amongst all these poets. And I felt, oh, I kind of want to be part of this dialogue. And so I would say that book also really pulled me into the world of poetry.
Okay. Yeah, it's always interesting. I'd never heard about that. Of course, I've heard about William Blake, but hadn't heard that collection. That's interesting to hear what people's influences are for sure. I thought it was so interesting in your book that you had the four unique sections. So I thought if it's all right, we'll talk a little bit about each section. The first one from your poem, Natural History, The Curious Institution, from the Curious Institution section. I think seem to really kind of come in hot, as they say, right off, talking about something that isn't often talked about, but should be about the slave trade and early sciences and how they're tied. Do you feel there is a reticence in the science community to look at that part of their history? And how do you feel that the sciences could improve on acknowledging that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think a very big question. I think this day and age, I mean, I can't talk about, well, we can imagine what it would have been like decades ago, like, say pre-civil rights era and these things. But I think for the moment, is not, I think it is a little bit of reticence, but I think also it's a large part, and I mean this in a true sense of the word ignorance, like people don't know. Like people like before I read the science article about the slave trades connections to natural history, I didn't know this. It wasn't part of my training. I knew like with say broad brushstrokes, just kind of knowing world history. If there is a gorilla caught in the wild pre-1960, this is from a former colony even if it's a zoo specimen pre-1960, like how did that gorilla get from, I don't know, Gabon or or Congo to the zoo in like New York or Chicago, right? So I kind of know from these like broader sense of history, these sorts of things, but something very specific like the slave trade's role, I had no clue about. Just because you're not taught this when being trained as a graduate student. Like I would say, for my knowledge, at least where I did my PhD, it was really grounded in, analysis. It was really grounded in like sort of specifics of the scientific method, so to speak. You know, adequate data collection for a hypothesis. What questions are you having? Kind of what's the bigger picture to your question? How are you converting it to a hypothesis? Kind of more the history of science itself, or the history of institutions like museums. It just wasn't covered. So I don't think anyone tried to hide it from me. I think even the people who were training me didn't know by and large. So I think this is something that really has to change in our discipline. I think a big part of it is teaching graduate students, like having topics about collections history or museum history, and you can talk about these things. You can talk about, well, yes, the collections are, marvelous, unique scientific tool, here for our use. But, how were they originally built? Why were they originally built? What means brought them to the museum? I think these are really, pressing questions to ask in this day and age. I think also, if we want to have, say, a welcoming institution, like a welcoming museum, like for visitors, even for getting people into science, I think it's best to be transparent about these issues. I think, it is a bit for me an issue of institutional integrity. If we're going to say that, yes, as scientists, you want to deal with, be objective, you want to deal with the truth, you want to go where the facts go. Well, I mean, this is historical fact, right? So I think, we kind of have to deal with this as a discipline to deal with this topic. Um, Whether people, I mean, I could see reticence on the parts of some colleagues if they feel that, oh, well, this makes, the collections look bad, or this makes the institution look bad. I can see that. And I have, asked a few colleagues who are historians of science, the reactions to their work, looking into museum collections, and they have told me they've gotten not a lot, but every once in a while they do get this kind of reaction from someone. Um, my feeling on that topic would be that it kind of is what it is. The collections, look bad because of their history, for a given collection. But I think the right thing to do is to try to be transparent and address this. Because if you try to hide it and keep it secret, then the current state of the institution looks bad, not just the historical aspect. So I think, it's best to be transparent. It's best to like talk about these things. Just so they're out in the open, just so, yeah, we just have a certain kind of base level integrity for the institution.
Yeah, I think that is so important. And I really appreciated actually that you started your book with that section because I think any great poetry helps people challenge how they think about something and the different ways they've seen it, portrayed before. So you really did a great job with that section in making us think about that and thinking about the transparency or lack thereof, depending on which university we're in. The second section was kind of a big shift, sort of in the memory museum, with thinking more about your own life and kind of acquaints us with people who influenced you in your early years and throughout life. And having been born and raised in the South myself, I feel the South and its complicated issues at times and volatile history definitely has an impact on anybody that comes from the South. How would you say, being from the region you're from, what influence, I guess, do you see that it has over your work or your interests in what you want to write about?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think, the first section of the book that you mentioned, and I would say also the last poem in the book, Blindfold Wonder, I think those in part might be born from, in some ways, from the experience of growing up in the South with its complicated history. I think, also I think just more broadly with the Black experience in the US, with the Great Migration going from the aftermath of the Civil War up to the North. these are all, and I guess the treatment in the North as opposed to the South and kind of the similarities and differences people encountered there, they're really complicated histories, that they're really painful histories in many cases, that I think to unpack, to reflect upon, you have to discuss, you have to confront at some level. I think it's not about instead of pointing a finger at someone or trying to blame someone, because I think sometimes these discussions kind of get caught up in that. I think it's really to move forward, you have to reflect. I think there are certain uncomfortable truths that we have to just get in the open and sort of reconcile as best we can. I kind of feel that's kind of the story of the South. It is a complicated, it is a violent history in many respects. Um, but it's just kind of, it is what it is. And I think, to go forward with any sort of cohesive society, any sort of cohesive body in the South, you have to try to reconcile this. You have to try to acknowledge this and say what happened, and get on the same page. Where do you go from there exactly? I'm not sure. But I felt it's the same way to try to address this in the book with the poems, where it's kind of this is a very uncomfortable history, I think, for some people. Like I had one colleague, like very well-meaning, after giving a reading, he asked me, he's like, is that what you really think when you walk through the exhibition in the museum? And when you see like the dinosaurs, is that what you think? And it's like, yeah, sometimes, And he's like, well, that makes me sad. I'm like, well, it is what it is. Like, it's not, you know, I don't think it's healthy to try to pretend none of this ever happened. So I think the past has a way of resurrecting itself, or insisting it be remembered in a way, put it that way. But I'd say there's another way to think about it, and I think it's like we're kind of living in a time of major global challenges. If you think of biodiversity loss, if you think of climate change and these things, and these are problems that are going to require a global solution, a global effort, and that means working with partners in the global South. And the thing is, if you start misremembering or discounting certain aspects of the history that were detrimental to them or painful or hurtful to them, that were committed by the global North, um, I think that leaves partners, that makes a much more difficult partnership. I think it leaves questions of, is there really respect from both sides in this partnership? Is there really goodwill from both sides in this partnership? And so I think these things just really have to be discussed. There's not really a way around it.
Well, I definitely think your poetry certainly accomplishes that and helps people have more discussion surrounding that. And I appreciate that you're willing to do that for sure. I think the next section, I like as well how you sort of do a back and forth of a little bit more hard hitting than descriptive and kind of memory type poem or nostalgia more. Then we go a little bit into the descriptive part with the dispatches from Ellesmere. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That seems like such a beautiful place, and that you got to go and do field work, and you do such an eloquent job of describing it to us as readers. What is it about that island that makes it such a sought after ecosystem for research? And what are some of the most, like, what's one of the most beneficial works you've seen come out of that research in that area?
Yeah, I can't give an overview of all the research happening on Ellesmere. I think it's very diverse. So I remember when I was there with Neil Shubin, Tracy Jenkins, and Ted Deschler, there's also a team, I think they might be out there every year. I think a team from like doing sort of astronomy and doing sort of astrophysics. I think it's more astronomy. And they're trying to replicate the environments found on like the moon or Mars. And I think they're doing this on Ellesmere because there's no like very little vegetation. It can be very dry parts of the year. So it's kind of their model environment to try to, I guess, as close as they can replicate on Earth in some respects to their environments they encounter on, out beyond Earth, these extraterrestrial environments. Um, in the past, I know they've done work on fossil ecosystems, looking at, I guess, paleobotany, looking at ancient fossilized forest. And then of course there's the like Ellesmere Island, Tiktaalik, quarries. I think people are drawn to the island though. I think people fall in love with the island because it's so unusual. At least, if you're from, I guess, northern Canada, if you're from like northernmost Europe, beyond the tree line, I guess it's like every day for you, right? But I think for those of us who live well below the tree line, who live, farther south in the US or like farther south in Europe, or even farther south than that, it just seems like a very alien environment. Like just having, yeah, like no trees around. I mean, really, like the vegetation by and large didn't go above my ankle, if I remember correctly. Um, and so there's this sense of space that's just really hard to describe. And with space, it's hard to gauge distance. So it's like, oh, that's just a little ridge over there. I'll walk there. And you're walking for like 30 minutes. It's like, okay, that doesn't seem to be any closer. Um, so it's just kind of, in some ways, a surreal environment, right? And I remember when I came back to Chicago, or even like to the hotel in Ottawa, because we stopped the night in Ottawa before going back to our homes, and being in the hotel hallway and just the walls around me kind of freaking me out because all of a sudden I felt like I was very boxed in after being a month in this very open, broad, spacious environment. Um, but I guess to go back to the science, I think Tiktaalik and the things found there, because they tie so much into, amniote origins, tetrapod or well, not necessarily amnio, but tetrapod origins. Um, and I think it's such a crucial chapter in the evolution of vertebrates. Um, I think it just really draws people there. I think, to be part of that line of research, to, I guess in some ways, look after this or go pursue this missing link, quote unquote, this transitional form. Um, I think it really draws people there. And so I think that aspect plus the sort of otherworldly environment. I mean, also things like there's been studies on the wolf population. There are dwarf caribou populations on Ellesmere. Um, so I guess ecological reasons, there's studies being done. But yeah, I guess somehow it's just kind of so unusual in a way for me. I mean, I'm giving you my own impression. Just so unusual, um, that is just kind of special and kind of like, it's like a very unscientific term, but magical. It's just kind of hard to describe, looking back on it.
Well, that's
Um,
definitely how it came across in your poems. I'm not a traveler, but they made me want to go there for sure. But yeah,
yeah.
definitely that magicalness and kind of alienness came across, and that was a beautiful section.
Oh, thank
I
you.
am thinking about the final section of Blindfold Wonder. That's a great name as well. And with the whole sensory experience of it, in the poem that you named for the section, you delve a little bit into the rarity in your field of being a Black man in that poem. And how do you feel that life experience kind of has made its mark on your poetry and how you see things?
Yeah. I think part of it is I feel compelled, like going back to the first section of the book, like to the Curious Institution, um, and talking about these uncomfortable truths. I think part of the Black experience, at least in the US, is, in a sense, it's uncomfortable, right? Like you're dealing with issues of slavery, you're dealing with issues of discrimination. That's not the whole of the Black experience. There is Black joy. Um, you know, their contributions beyond the suffering, and the oppression. But at the same time, that's just a big part of the story. There's not a way around that. So, it makes me want to go into this history, this sort of, again, uncomfortable history. I think the other thing is I see that more people are talking about it now. I can think of my colleague Miranda Lowe in the UK. She's doing museum detox and these things, and she's raising awareness of this. I know the New York Times had an article maybe a year or two ago about parachute paleontology. So awareness is getting there. But I still think for me, not enough people are talking about it. And so it becomes a question of, I am a rarity, at least for now. Hopefully that changes, but I'm still a rarity in this field. Um, if I don't speak up about it, am I somehow complicit in the silence? And that's, why I'm partly compelled to raise this. Because I think, coming from this background and being aware of my history, like my broader history, um, you see things in a certain light. Not a certain light, but you're just aware of certain chapters of history, I think, more than other people who don't come from that background, put it that way. And that awareness extends into kind of, all, how can I say this? All stages, all venues, all arenas of my life. So it's just an awareness. And the question is, I want other people to be aware. I mean, maybe to go back to one of your earlier questions in a way, in writing this, I don't just want people to just flat out agree with me, blindly agree with me. I would rather they read the work, reflect, and think about what I'm saying and come to their own conclusion. It'd be very nice if they agree with me after they think about it. But I think the critical thing here is that the people really think, the readers really think about what I'm saying. And even if they feel the history should be acknowledged in a different way, or they feel that it's not so bad or worse than I think it is even, just acknowledge the events that happened. Just an awareness, a kind of sensitivity to past events. So I mean, I think that's the thing. I think in some ways it's the past informs the present, right? And I think, particularly when you are any kind of minority where it's, ethnic, racial, religious, gender, um, your past kind of determines your present in a way it doesn't for the majority, whatever the majority is in the given context. So I think, yeah, you just have to be aware of the past and how it shapes the reality you deal with in your present day. And yeah, that's what I'm just trying to, I guess, communicate with the poems in the book.
Well, I would imagine you get to communicate a different type of awareness, even though your awareness and your ability to tap into that probably helps your science work as well. It's such a different use for it in your poetry. So I'm sure that's fulfilling.
I mean, it is. Interacting with colleagues who've read the poems and seeing their reaction. I think I am at least touching people to get them to think about these topics. Their ultimate conclusions, I don't know. Some tell me, kind of like right on, you're on the right track. I don't know if everyone feels that way, to be honest. But I'm just really happy if people engage with the work, like in good faith, and think about what's written and yeah, just consider there's multiple perspectives out there. I guess the thing is kind of when you're looking at collections and collections-based research, the collections are a tool for research. Yes, they are. Absolutely. And I think, with things like biodiversity loss, things like climate change, we really need collections-based research now. Like it's really vital. At the same time, though, these objects are not purely tools of scientific research. They're also objects in of themselves with a history that ties to societal history, ties to personal history, ties to other aspects of history. And so I think this sort of duality of specimens, needs to be addressed and thought about a bit. In some ways, I think, if you consider the colonial aspect of museums and collections, the specimens are kind of like tangible proof, a tangible like manifestation of those histories, right? And so I think, if you think about it, we can learn a lot, not just about science, but also history itself, like human history, using the collections, and doing provenance research and these things. So I think, Yeah, we just have to be aware of different perspectives and really what those perspectives can inform us, like what they can teach us in different ways.
Well, I'm really looking forward already to your next collection because I think you're going to keep endeavoring to do that and helping people ask the hard questions surrounding things to do with science or just life that they haven't asked before. So I appreciate that about your poetry very much.
No,
I
thank
thought
you.
it's been great to hear more about your work. I thought if you wouldn't mind, you could close it out by picking a poem that you want to read for us from your book and hold up your book for us. I'm going to
Sure.
make sure I put it at the end of the video too with links. I have already passed on my copy to another person who really wanted to read it. So,
Okay.
or I
Thank
would
you.
hold it up myself because I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I even made a point. I'm bad about marking in books, but I made a point to just post it that one because I knew I was going to give it to a friend.
Okay. Well, here's the book. Um, it comes out November 4th from Grey Wolf Press. You can pre-order it. I think most online outlets have it. So yeah. And I'll read a poem from the Dispatches from Ellesmere section called Guild Beginnings. And it's about working in the quarry that yielded Tiktaalik and other Devonian fish the field season I was there. So that was 2006. Yeah, so it's kind of a meditation on just the day-to-day drudgery, I used to call it drudgery, task of digging, looking for fossils. So yeah, Guild Beginnings. On the trail of oblivion's beast, their lives now nothing more than tales sealed down in deposits of bones sown epochs ago. We have traveled across the globe to search for their fabled remains at this glacier-scraped latitude. The lynx ventured to retrieve their stories, like something out of the myth of seafarers after the gold of a ram's flayed fleece, its wool lying at the world's known edge, lustrous as a hearth's flame. Leaving camp each morning, trudging over dips and tussocks of moss, and following the treeless valley, we come to the outcrop, set about the sweat-beating business of shoveling away overburden, combing the hillside's scree for the telltale hue and texture, betraying weathered-out bone. Scrappy inklings leading us to where in the quarry we'll settle on our knees, our focus trained on the revelations of broken strata. Working with awl and brush, we clear away stone and dust, keen to see what the rock will reward us for having journeyed so far north. Ancient sediment now cemented, crumbling before our tools. We expose a placoderm's skull roof armor and the crushing teeth of lungfish, once the bane of snails and bivalves. Their bone bed marked with glyphs of scattered fin rays records a scene surviving an ecosystem vanished. Devonian waters in its day, drowning where we now toil. Exhuming the extinct shoal from its stranding in the subterranean, we whittle down the unknowns that still riddle evolution's selection of a fish to fashion into an amphibian. This in turn starting a saga in which amphibians were fashioned into reptiles, and then reptiles into mammals, with niches novel, vacated, or usurped, engraving their ossified signature upon jaws, vertebrae, and limb bones, brain cases, and encaging ribs, in workshops of mountains and deeps, dunes and caves, jungles and rivers, only at some point to stumble on bipedal apes in a Miocene paradise, dew-jeweled grasses and riverbanks loud with pearl song, the testing grounds for our upright strides. Millions of years of shape-shifting since that first departure from water, leaving guild beginnings forgotten to us. Beneath the sun's ceaseless glare, our jackets stripped off and cast aside, we hunch over crack-hammered stone, shoulders and arms sore from days of toiling to piece together the fractured lore of creations, glacially improvised. These bones cached in strata are translators' key to read lost tales in the language of dead species. The origin stories inscribed into skeletons, forever handed down and adapted, vessels of rock-kept knowledge, embodying an anatomical chronicle, no less miraculous than golden wool gleaming red. Thanks.
Thank you very much for sharing that. It struck me as you're reading it and as I read it before, that it was such a metaphor in a way for what your whole book is doing, is reviving stories in a sense. And it really takes us, we were right there with you. I can really picture all of that so keenly. So it's beautiful. And yet parts of it are kind of savage and visceral, but still, and I love how you ended it with a color.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us, and I'll be sure and put the link to pre-order everything at the end of the video, but we'll sign off now and I'll